Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. There will be themes that I'll be coming back to time because they are so important. It's not enough to see just a handful or two or even three examples which I may have covered in a previous lesson, but it's important to come back to it, and hopefully when you hear about a topic for the second or third time, you'll have a better understanding of it and say, oh, I got it. This is the solution here. This is one of those occasions. In this lesson, I'll be talking about removing the guard, which we also refer to as deflection. Well, in this lesson, we'll focus on removing a guard from a certain key square. And let me move on to our very first example in this lesson. Here we go. In this position, a simple position, black is a bishop ahead. Typically, that's the first thing we should establish, who is ahead on the material scale. Once we know that can influence a whole lot of decisions, such as trading queens or other pieces or not. Then one of the next questions should be, what is our opponent's threat? Does our opponent want to capture one of our pieces that's not protected? And at the same go, is there a piece that we can capture that the opponent doesn't protect or doesn't protect sufficiently? Only after those basic questions that we answered, we move on and think a bit more concretely or deeper in 2 or 3 or longer move combinations. So in the positions that we see in front of us right now, as we said, black is a bishop up, so normally speaking, we would not want to trade queens or other pieces, because that generally would just help our opponent if we're playing white. However, there is a very important other element that we need to recognize here, and that is namely that black has a back rank problem. What that means is that black still has his 2 pawns on the 7th rank in front of his castled king, which is in the corner, and if the white rook succeeds to move down to f8, that could be checkmate. Although it's not difficult to see that if white would try to do that immediately, the black queen could just capture that white rook. So therefore, here, white needs to do something to remove the guard of that key f8 square. And in this case, it's not very difficult, because by capturing the black queen with a simple offer to trade, white exactly accomplishes just that. If now the black rook captures the white queen, checkmate arrives immediately with rook f2 to f8. On the other hand, if in the starting position the white queen captures and black does not recapture, all that means is that black lost his queen without any further compensation, and in fact, after some move that, for example, would defend against the checkmate by opening a little window for the black king, black would lose even further material, the rook. So the gain on white's side is quite obvious. Let's move on to our next example, when we'll witness something very similar. Here we go. In this position, black has not just an extra bishop, but in addition an extra knight and pawn as well, while each side has a queen and rook. Here, the checkmate pattern is very similar when the edge of the board and black's own pieces, in this case on the g file, the rook on g8 and the pawn on g7 especially, limit the black king's mobility or possibilities to escape. Here again, we can recognize that if white would try to give checkmate immediately on that open H file, for example, by playing rook to H4, that would not quite work because the black queen could capture it. It wouldn't work either if the white queen would try to checkmate because the black pawn would capture. So here we are back to our theme, which is removing the guard. It's not hard to believe that the pawn on G6 is hard to remove. On the other hand, white has a rather natural and simple way to remove the guard of the H4 square, namely the black queen. Here again, just like in the previous example, white would capture the black queen, again defining the general principle that when we are behind in material, we normally do not want to exchange further pieces. However, not in a situation like this, when after a trade, we are immediately able to win, that is, checkmate our opponent. Let's move on and see another example on the same subject. In this situation, there are no queens on the board, and black's material advantage is less than it was in our previous example so far. Here, each side has a rook and knight, and the black has an additional 2 pawns. As I said, get used to the habit to first establish the material balance. See which materials, which pieces each side have, and I suggest not to add up all the numbers, such as 5 for the rook, 3 for the knight, and so on, because then it's going to be a bit more complicated and a larger number. Try to count if each side has a rook, that balances each other out. If each side has a knight, that balances each other out. So try to come to a number in that way to see only what is different between the two camps. And here you'll see black having 2 extra pawns. 4 versus 2. In this position, it is white's turn, and white has an option to capture a pawn for free on f7, and in fact with a check. This is one of those situations when you see a good move, because certainly knight takes pawn is a good move, it is capturing a pawn for free. However, remember, when you see a good move, always look around and see if you have something even much better. That may be capturing a different piece, a more valuable piece, or it may be checkmating your opponent. In this case, the optimal move for white is to capture the black knight on G6 with a check. Again, just as we mentioned in the previous 2 examples, just trading in itself would not be a good idea without seeing the right follow-up after black would capture the knight, which is now the rook capturing the pawn, ending the game with a very similar checkmate as in the very last position. Again, looking at the position from black's perspective, of course, if you see that checkmate is coming on the following move, you have to do whatever you can, rather not capturing your opponent's knight and move out from the check. While white's advantage is quite clear in this situation also, the game still continues. White still needs to find a number of good moves to win the game. The next one in line is not to capture the pawn on h4 immediately. White has a much better move, namely moving the knight to e7, with that attacking the black rook on g8. And now, if that black rook moves away, white again ends the game immediately by the rook takes pawn checkmate. As you can see, the white knight controls the two potential escape squares of the black king. Therefore, after knight takes king h7 and knight e7, black has to unfortunately give up his rook also, and the best he can do is advance the pawn, protect the pawn on h4, and then knight takes, king takes, and still lose the game after white's a pawn would run away, become a queen, which against black can do nothing. The black king is too far away from the a8 promotion square. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, white has two rooks, a bishop, and black has a whole bunch of pieces. Again, let's see how should we calculate, out to figure out who is ahead. The way we do it, we say rook versus rook, even. Then we go further, bishop versus bishop, even. And then white has an extra rook because black does not have his second rook, but black has an extra knight and an extra 2 pawns. As we know, a rook is worth 5 points, and so is a knight plus 2 pawns. So materially speaking, the position is completely balanced. However, since it's white's turn, white can immediately force checkmate in just a couple of moves. We can see that the black king is kind of cornered in a way because the white bishop is rather strong on the h5 e8 diagonal, and the white rook is also looking that way. So if the white rook would be able to come down to e8, that could be checkmate if it wasn't for the black rook defending that square from c8. Seeing the previous 3 examples, hopefully you'll have an idea what white should do right now. White should make an exchange between the rooks. In fact, it's a forced move, checking the black king. Black doesn't have any good moves. For example, after knight takes rook, finally the white rook can freely move down to e8 and announce checkmate. In all of these examples, we saw that an exchange resulted in removing the guard of a certain square. Now, we'll move on to a slightly different situation. Here we go. Here, it's a roughly symmetrical pawn structure, and black is ahead, having still his queen on the board, while white has only a rook and knight in exchange. In addition, the white knight is under attack at the moment. However, we also see the white rook being in an optimal position, cutting away access to the f-file for the black king. But that in itself is not enough. White here needs to find the key move which forces the black king to the corner. Imagine if this black king would be forced to move to h8. That would mean that the white rook would be ready to come down to f8 and announce checkmate. Of course, the immediate rook f8 would only be a check because the black king could safely capture that rook. In this case, white needs to give a deadly check by knight to e7. As I mentioned, the white rook cuts off the squares on the f-file from the black king, therefore leaving black only one legal move, moving into the corner, and indeed allowing the white rook to move up and announce checkmate. Let's see a couple of more examples on this very same theme. Here we go. In this example, try to figure out again how much is white's material advantage. If your answer was that white is up by 2 points, you were correct. Again, as you can see, each side has a pair of rooks, but white has a second rook as well against black bishop, and the difference between those two pieces, the value between those pieces are 5 versus 3, so gives white 2 points plus. However, as I have already mentioned in previous lessons, there is an order of priority in chess just like in life. First of all, the safety of the kings is the number 1 on the list. Only number 2 is the material balance. And in this case, even though white is ahead by material because they neglected paying attention to the safety of their king, they are getting in trouble. If white would have moved their pawn up by just 1 square either pawn, white would be in a much better position and could likely to play for a win. But because white instead moved their rook from b1 to b7 on their last move, attacking black's bishop, they forgot a very similar idea as we've just seen in the last position, where the white knight checked the black king in the previous example and forced it to the corner and then allowing white to checkmate. Here, black is the one doing the same to white by moving his bishop to c5, moving the bishop away from the attack and, more importantly, checking the white king. Again, the black rook is guarding the key f1 square where the white king cannot move to right now. And as soon as the white king moves to the corner without having any other option, white has to do that, and then the black rook just moves down and gives back rank checkmate. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. Again, white in this case has clear material advantage, having their queen still on the board, as well as having 1 extra pawn compared to black. If it were white's turn, white would be in real good shape, but it is black's turn. And here again, black can achieve a similar checkmate as he did in the previous positions. In this case, black's problem is that his own bishop on e2 stands in his rook's way to come down to e1. In this position, black has an additional issue to worry about, namely that if black doesn't make the right move, the white king can just escape on g2. Of course, it would be slow just to move the bishop away, let's say to g4, with the idea to open the e-file for the black rook, because, for example, white could give a check and then simply capture the bishop, and after the rook e1, the king can just run out to g2. Another advice that's worth remembering is, first, try to look at forceful moves. And the most forceful type of moves are that are check, because they clearly limit the options of the opponent. So in this case, that check is bishop to f3. Of course, that's not to say that every check is good, but it's the first thing to look at. When the white king makes its only move to g1, white now is getting checkmated because the black rook comes down to e1, and it's a beautiful collaboration between the black bishop on f3 not letting the king out and the rook attacking the king. Let's see one more example on this theme. Here we go. In this case, it is black who is ahead. Black has the queen, while white has only bishop and rook. And again, white's turn. If it were black's turn, black would win the game easily. by capturing, for example, the pawn on h3. However, because it is white's turn, white has full control of the d-file, which is extremely important not to allow the black king to run away. And again, the same theme, white needs to push the black king away from c8 back to b8. After seeing all these previous examples, this shouldn't be a hard thing to find. Namely, the bishop should go to f5, and then king b8, rook checkmates. Well, I'm hoping that after seeing all these examples on this theme, when you will face an opportunity in your games, you will not miss it, and you will turn around a worse game or just decide a game to your favor with one of these motifs. And now let's see another theme or another method on this same issue on removing the guard. And here the theme will be promoting a passed pawn. Here we go. This is something very, very common, that you would have a pawn or two running ahead and attempting to become a queen. In this case, both of the white pawns are just one square away from promotion. However, the problem seems to be that the black king stands right in between them, and either of the white pawns promote, it could be captured by the black king. Nevertheless, if white advances the correct pawn, even though giving up one of the pawns, the second pawn will safely be promoted to a queen. Try to figure out which is the correct pawn push first, and then come back and listen to the solution. It would be a big mistake to promote the d pawn first, because then after black capturing the newly born queen, the black bishop would guard the promotion square of the f pawn. On the other hand, after the correct pawn promotion on f8, when black captures the new queen, after the d pawn also gets promoted, white has an easily winning advantage. Let's see another situation where again white has two pawns about to get promoted, but it's rather important which pawn white promotes first. If white would mistakenly promote the c pawn first, which is not guarded by black's king, it would give black time to promote his own pawn to b1 with a check, very importantly, and only when the white king moves out of the check, then black would freely capture white's second pawn, and queen versus queen is not a win in most of the cases, just like here. This is a very important trick that I suggest you remember, that white advances the pawn that promotes with a check first. Even though that black can capture that queen, now white promotes the second pawn again with a check, not giving time for the black pawn to get promoted. And when the black king moves out of the check, white can simply fork, give a check to the black king, and then on the following move, capture black's only pawn. Let's see one more example. Here we go. In this case, it's absolutely crucial that white maintains his last pawn, because as we know, a king and bishop does not win against a king. It's not sufficient winning material. Advancing the pawn ahead wouldn't help because the black king could just capture it. On the other hand, the winning move is to simply protect the pawn, even though it seems that black can capture the bishop. But if they do, then white's pawn is unstoppable, unlike black's, which can easily be caught by white's king. And let's see our final example, where white has an extra knight and pawn. But remember, if white loses his last pawn and will be left only with king and knight versus black's king, the game is a draw. But white has a good move that protects the pawn. In fact, it seems that white has two good moves, but reality is that only one of them gives the win for white. After knight e8, black could save the game by moving king to f7, attacking the knight again, and if now the knight moves, white's pawn is lost, or otherwise the knight is lost, resulting in an objectively drawn endgame which we already studied at one of the earlier lessons. On the other hand, the move that seemingly puts the knight under attack is the correct way to defend the pawn for a similar reason as in the last example. We use the same idea with the bishop. If black does not capture the knight now, white would simply bring the king up and help the pawn getting promoted. And of course, if king takes knight, the white pawn becomes a queen. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned some important ideas about how to gain advantage or checkmate your opponent. So long until next week. Bye-bye.